The air on threshold tasted like copper and ozone, a combination that made every breath feel like licking a battery. Not that he'd ever actually licked a battery, but standing in the perpetual twilight of this tidally locked rock, surrounded by plants that glowed like someone had spilled a rave into a greenhouse. It seemed like the kind of stupid thing a person might do just to feel something familiar. His collection drone buzzed overhead, its sensors whirring as it cataloged yet another species of bioluminescent moss that probably had some incredibly boring scientific name he'd have to look up later. He'd been on Threshold for 3 weeks and had already discovered that xenobotany, despite what the recruitment videos suggested, was 90% waiting for plants to do absolutely nothing, and 10% trying not to trip over roots that pulsed with their own heartbeat. The quicksand pools started about 30 meters ahead, their surfaces deceptively smooth in the dim light. His briefing materials had called them microbial aggregation zones with non-Newtonian fluid properties, which was a fancy way of saying they were hungry dirt that would swallow you whole while microscopic organisms threw a party on your dissolving corpse. He'd marked them on his map with little skull icons because the cartography software didn't have an option for land that actively wants to eat you. That's when he saw the Kethray woman stumble. She'd been moving with the same liquid grace he'd observed in all the indigenous people, her skin shifting through shades of amber and bronze that seemed to respond to the environment like a mood ring designed by evolution. 3 others accompanied her, maintaining a respectful distance, their own pattern steady and formal. When her foot broke through the crust and she began to sink, he expected them to react. Instead, they stopped walking and formed a circle. They started humming. Not screaming, not rushing forward with ropes or branches, or any of the sensible things humans might do when watching someone slowly vanish into malevolent pudding. Just humming, a low, resonant sound that made his teeth ache. The woman herself had gone completely still, her arms at her sides, her expression blank as the sand crept up to her waist. His brain, which had been pleasantly occupied with botanical trivia and complaints about the taste of the air, suddenly kicked into a higher gear that felt suspiciously like panic, wrapped in a thin veneer of, surely I'm misunderstanding this situation. He looked at the woman. He looked at the humming circle. He looked at his equipment drone, which was utterly useless for anything except telling him the chemical composition of someone's impending doom. The sand reached her chest. "Oh, for crying out loud," he muttered, and broke into a run. His sampling pole telescoped out to 3 meters with a click that sounded absurdly cheerful under the circumstances. He dropped to his knees at the edge of the pool, the ground biting into his legs through his suit, and extended the pole toward her. She turned her head, those strange double-lidded eyes blinking horizontally at him with what he desperately hoped was recognition, and not the Kethray equivalent of "what is this idiot doing?" "Grab it!" he shouted, though his translator was probably mangling whatever he was actually saying into something like, Seize the stick of salvation. Or, possibly, I am deeply confused, but committed. She didn't grab it. She stared at him like he'd just suggested they restructure the fundamental laws of physics. Behind her, the humming stopped, which somehow felt worse than when it had been happening. He could feel the weight of alien attention pressing against the back of his skull. The sand touched her collarbone. He hooked the pole under her arm and pulled, his muscles screaming, his knees sliding forward on the treacherous ground. She fought him. Actually fought him, twisting against the pole like she was trying to complete her drowning on schedule. The absurdity of it all flashed through his mind. He was going to die on an alien planet in a tug of war with someone who apparently had a prior engagement with liquefied death. Then she emerged, sliding free with a sound like a sink, unclogging. And they both collapsed backward onto solid ground. He lay there, gasping, his heart attempting to audition for a percussion solo, while she slowly sat up and turned those impossible eyes on him fully. Her skin had gone completely still, locked into a pattern he didn't recognize. The other Kethray surrounded them now, silent as monuments. Nobody was humming. Nobody was moving. They just stared, and in the growing darkness of Threshold's eternal twilight, he realized his translation software had absolutely nothing helpful to offer about what happened when you interrupted something you didn't understand. The Habitat Dome's environmental systems hummed their usual symphony of life support while he sat at his workstation, staring at a screen full of anthropological data that might as well have been written in interpretive dance for all the good it was doing him. His AI assistant, which he'd named Morton because it had the personality of a particularly judgmental librarian, had been giving him variations of "I told you so" for the past 6 hours. The expedition briefing contained 17 distinct warnings about cultural interference, Morton said again, his synthesized voice dripping with the kind of satisfaction only an AI could muster when watching an organic being contemplate their mistakes. You acknowledged each one with a thumbs-up emoji. I was eating breakfast, he muttered, scrolling through a database entry about Kethray spiritual practices that used words like inevitable and cosmic adjudication with alarming frequency. Nobody actually reads those things. They're like software license agreements. Software license agreements occasionally prevent legal action. Cultural briefings occasionally prevent you from accidentally committing theological blasphemy. He pulled up a grainy video some previous expedition had captured, showing Kethray gathered around what the notes identified as the judge, which turned out to be the exact same type of quicksand pool he'd just violated with his ignorant heroics. In the footage, someone had fallen in. Nobody helped. The person sank, the others sang, and then everyone walked away like they'd just witnessed a particularly moving theater performance instead of a death. So let me get this straight, he said, rubbing his temples. The living sands are some kind of divine judgment system, like cosmic trial by drowning? The anthropological team's best interpretation suggests the Kethray view the quicksand pools as manifestations of natural truth. Those who fall have been selected by the universe itself to receive an answer about their place in existence. And the answer is always, you should die in this specific puddle. Apparently, the universe has a limited vocabulary. He spent the next 3 days trying to work while fighting the urge to check his perimeter sensors every 5 minutes. The bioluminescent plants he was supposed to be studying seemed to mock him with their own brutal survival strategies. He'd documented a vine species that strangled its own offspring when water became scarce, a flower that attracted pollinators, then dissolved them for nutrients, and a moss that grew exclusively on the corpses of its parent colony. Everything on this planet had apparently attended the same seminar on ruthless efficiency. On the 4th morning, his sensors woke him with an alert that made his stomach drop through the floor. 43 heat signatures arranged in a perfect circle around his dome, like someone had decided to play Ring Around the Habitat with an entire village's worth of people who probably wanted to discuss his recent interference in their religious practices. Morton, please tell me those readings are wrong. The sensors are functioning within normal parameters. However, I can lie to you if it would improve your emotional state. Yes, please. Those readings are wrong. You're actually surrounded by 43 very angry thermal vents that coincidentally formed a geometrically perfect circle. He activated the external cameras with shaking hands. The Kethray stood in absolute stillness. Their skin patterns, locked into formal configurations, he was beginning to recognize as ceremonial. At the center of the circle stood the woman he'd pulled from the sand. Now we're wearing what looked like leadership markers, bands of some material that caught the dim light and threw it back in colors that shouldn't exist. She was staring directly at the camera. Morton, what are my options here? Option 1, defensive lockdown. Option 2, emergency evacuation. Option 3, existential panic followed by poor decision-making. Which one do you recommend? As an AI, I'm programmed to suggest option 1. As an observer of your pattern of behavior, I predict you'll choose option 3. He looked at the screen, at the woman whose life he'd saved, and whose existence he'd apparently rendered philosophically impossible, and felt something shift in his chest. Maybe it was courage. Maybe it was stupidity. With his track record, probably both. Get my translator ready, he said, standing up and moving toward the airlock. And if this goes badly, make sure my last words are something cooler than what I'm about to say. Your last words are currently, get my translator ready, which rates approximately 3 out of 10 on the heroic scale. Thanks, Morton. Your support means everything. I know. It's my primary function to provide emotional validation while you make questionable choices. He opened the door and stepped into the copper-tasting air, unarmed and uncertain, while 43 pairs of alien eyes watched him emerge into the judgment he'd been avoiding. The Kethray didn't move as he stepped outside, which was somehow more unsettling than if they'd immediately rushed him with whatever passed for pitchforks on threshold. The woman at the center of the circle watched him approach with those horizontal blinking eyes, her skin patterns holding steady in shades of bronze threaded through with silver that his brain kept trying to interpret as jewelry, but was definitely just her actual skin doing impossible things. She spoke, and his translator implant took a moment to buffer before offering up something that sounded like it had been run through 3 different linguistic philosophy courses. You have created void debt. I've created what now? The translation software spun its wheels, throwing up etymology charts and cultural context windows that crowded his vision like the world's worst augmented reality advertisement. Morton's voice whispered through his earpiece. Rough translation. An obligation that exists outside normal social framework because it should never have existed at all. So like a student loan, your attempt at humor is noted and discouraged. The woman stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the rocky ground. Up close, he could see that her skin wasn't just changing colors, but displaying patterns that moved like weather systems, flowing and reforming with purpose he couldn't decipher. She continued speaking, and his implant struggled to keep pace. I am daughter to the chief of the Sunrise Clan. My name carries the meaning of ember through smoke. By pulling me from the judge, you have rendered my existence theoretically impossible within the truth of our people. Theoretically impossible seems like an exaggeration. You're standing right here. I can see you being extremely possible. One of the warriors behind her made a sound that the translator tagged as either aggressive challenge or suppressed laughter, and he decided to believe it was the latter because optimism was all he had left. The woman's skin patterns flickered, a brief ripple of something his database tentatively labeled as surprise adjacent. I should be dead, she said, and the translator was more confident about that phrase, which didn't make him feel any better. Therefore, I am not alive. Therefore, I am other. That's some pretty aggressive binary thinking. What about the third option, where you're just alive because I pulled you out of homicidal pudding? There is no word in our language for what you describe. The word is rescue. It's a very popular concept where I come from. We have entire career paths dedicated to it. She tilted her head in a way that made him think of birds studying something they might want to eat. The only way to resolve the paradox of my existence is for my clan to determine what you are. Only something beyond our understanding of nature could create such a violation of truth. I'm definitely not beyond anyone's understanding. I'm barely beyond my own understanding. This morning, I put my boots on the wrong feet and didn't notice for 20 minutes. The flicker in her skin patterns came again, stronger this time, rippling outward like dropping a stone in water. Another warrior made that sound, and this time 2 others joined in. A strange huffing noise that had to be laughter, because the alternative was wheezing disapproval, and he was choosing to live in a universe where aliens found him funny. You will accompany us to our settlement, she said, and the translator added a footnote that the phrasing indicated neither request nor command, but something in between that human language didn't quite capture. Not as prisoner, but as unresolved question. Is there a meaningful difference between those two categories? Prisoners are understood. Questions are dangerous. Morton's voice chirped in his ear. From a survival standpoint, unresolved question ranks only marginally higher than prisoner and significantly lower than person who stayed in his habitat and minded his own business. The woman whose name meant Ember through smoke extended her hand, palm up, in what he desperately hoped was a gesture of peace and not an invitation to ritual combat. Her skin, where their hands would touch, had shifted to a pale gold that reminded him of dawn, which felt either prophetic or ironic, and he wasn't sure which worried him more. Your people have a saying about curiosity and small earth mammals, Morton offered helpfully. Not now, Morton. He took her hand. Her skin was warmer than he expected, and the patterns flowed around his fingers like they were trying to read him the same way he was trying to read them. The circle of Kethray parted, forming a path that led away from his habitat dome and into the deeper twilight, where the bioluminescent flora grew thick enough to navigate by. So, he said, because his mouth apparently worked independently of his survival instinct, do unresolved questions get bathroom breaks? Or is that also a paradox? The journey to the Kethray settlement took 2 days through terrain that seemed designed by a committee of sadists with degrees in hostile ecology. Plants with thorns that tracked movement, fungal blooms that released hallucinogenic spores if you breathed wrong, and at one point, a grove of trees that screamed when the wind touched them, which Morton unhelpfully informed him was a defense mechanism against herbivores, but felt more like the planet's way of editorializing on his life choices. Ember through smoke walked beside him, occasionally pointing out hazards with the casual tone of someone describing interesting cloud formations, rather than explaining which specific puddle would digest him alive. He learned more in those 2 days than 3 weeks of database reading had taught him. The Kethray viewed death not as enemy, but as sculptor, the forerers that shamed their people into truth. Those who died had simply received their answer from the universe. Those who survived were still being asked questions. So what happens when someone gets saved by someone else? He asked on the second day, after narrowly avoiding a sinkhole that Morton insisted on calling a aggressive geographical feature. She went quiet for so long he thought he'd crossed some invisible line before finally speaking. It almost never happens. When it does, both the saved and the saver are usually exiled together. They become their own answer, separate from the rest of us. That seems lonely. Truth is often lonely. The settlement appeared at dusk. Buildings grown from the same bioluminescent material as the native plants, their walls pulsing with soft light that made the whole place look like a dream someone was having about architecture. Kethray emerged from doorways and paths, their skin patterns shifting as they watched him pass, and he felt like a typo in a carefully written document. The chief sat at the center of a circular chamber, his skin bearing patterns so complex they seemed to contain entire historical archives. When he spoke, the translator gave up trying to capture nuance and just fed him raw meaning. Judgment, question, impossibility, resolution. The clan gathered, forming concentric circles, and began to debate his nature with the kind of philosophical intensity he'd only previously encountered in graduate seminars about the definition of consciousness. Perhaps he is a new kind of judge, one warrior suggested, a judge that returns what it takes. Judges do not return. That is the nature of truth. Then perhaps our understanding of truth is incomplete. The debate spiraled through concepts his translator could barely handle, and he stood there, feeling like an exam question that nobody could agree on the answer to. Ember through smoke remained silent beside him, until finally she stood, and the chamber fell quiet, with a speed that suggested everyone had been waiting for her to speak. Perhaps mercy itself is a natural force we have failed to recognize, she said, and her skin patterns blazed with colors that made his eyes water. As real as gravity, as inevitable as decay. Perhaps being saved is not corruption of the judge's verdict, but revelation of a different question entirely. The chief's patterns shifted, flowing through configurations that might have been thoughtfulness or might have been the alien equivalent of an existential crisis. You suggest we have been answering only half of the universe's questions. I suggest that perhaps there are forces we have been too rigid to see. He pulled me from the sand, not because he understood our ways, but because he did not. His ignorance revealed something we had forgotten to ask. What if survival itself is also an answer? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to collapse into a singularity. The chief stood, his patterns settling into something that looked almost like resolution, and approached him directly. You have broken something we believed could not be broken, the chief said, and in breaking it, you have shown us it was already incomplete. We do not know yet what this means, but we will learn. You may stay, as question, as teacher, as whatever truth you represent. He looked at Ember through smoke, whose patterns had shifted to something that might have been relief or might have been anticipation. He thought about his habitat dome, his plants, his mission to catalog things that glowed in the dark. He thought about how he'd spent 3 weeks avoiding meaningful contact with the only intelligent species on the planet because it was easier to study moss than to risk misunderstanding. I don't suppose you need a xenobotanist who's really good at making questionable decisions, he said. The chief's patterns rippled, and that huffing sound filled the chamber, dozens of Kethray laughing at once. Ember through smoke's hand found his, her skin warm and alive with patterns that danced like fire. We have never needed one before, she said, but perhaps that is another question we forgot to ask.